Hey guys, if you're studying for the NBCOT exam, then this video is for you. Now I know that graduation is right around the corner for a lot of OT students, so I just wanted to come on here and share some of the things that helped me on my journey to passing the NBCOT exam. My very first tip for the NBCOT exam would be to choose your study materials wisely. Please don't stress out about thinking that you were supposed to retain everything that you learned in OT school because that's just not possible. Also, don't freak out and grab every single textbook and all the notes you've ever taken and try to review all of those because that is just going to overwhelm you and you're going to feel even more stressed. So, what I mean by choosing your study resources wisely is to choose the books and the material that you think is going to provide the most information for the NBCOT exam. For example, when I was studying for the NBCOT, there were three main books that I used for studying. The three main books that I used were the Case Smith's Pediatric OT book, I used the Physical Disabilities book, and then I also used the 45 Days in Counting book. My second tip would be to choose the right practice materials. So I'm just going to list the resources that I used for practice test materials. So the first one I used was the Occupational Therapy Review Exam Guide. They also called it like the purple book. I'll post a picture of it right here, but remember, keep in mind these might have been updated. So I did think the practice questions in that book were pretty similar to the NBCOT actual questions, and they gave really good rationale. So I think it would be a really good resource, especially since there's like so many questions in that book. Another resource I used was TrueLearn, and I actually really loved TrueLearn. I felt like the practice questions on there were so similar to the actual NBCOT questions. And TrueLearn is all online. I believe it's like a membership or something like that. Usually, I know OT schools sign you up for like a free membership because it comes with the 45 Days in Counting book. So if your school did provide that resource for you, I would definitely take advantage of it because I really liked TrueLearn. It was a great resource. It gave great rationales. Everything was really clear. They also gave like diagrams and tables. And I liked that the practice questions were on like a computer because when you take your NBCOT exam, it's on a computer. So it kind of gives you that feel. And so I think it would be a really great resource for you if you're trying to get like just as close to the NBCOT as possible. So I also use the NBCOT practice quizzes and the AOTA practice tests. What I will say about the NBCOT practice quizzes, they are not really that similar to the NBCOT exam, which is kind of funny because they're questions made by NBCOT. Um, they're really simple questions. Some of them can get a little bit tricky. And I believe that they come like in modules, so they're like separated by categories, which that's cool. That works. NBCOT practice quizzes also come with like little games that you can play. I don't know. I did not find that helpful personally. So yeah, like if you had to choose between like the purple book and TrueLearn and the NBCOT practice quizzes, I probably wouldn't do the NBCOT practice quizzes. They're helpful, of course. So if you have the money for it, like go ahead and do it. But I felt like I kind of wasted my money buying that. And the last resource I used for practice test questions were the AOTA practice tests. So I am going to warn you right now that the AOTA practice tests are super hard. They're so hard. And like when I first took a practice test from AOTA, I failed it, and I had taken that right before my NBCOT exam, so I was freaking out. I didn't feel prepared. But it turns out that those are just like really extra hard, and they're actually not that similar to the actual test questions on the NBCOT exam. I felt like the questions on the NBCOT exam were so much easier than those questions, which is why I think I failed those whenever I would take those practice tests. So if you do buy the AOTA practice test, my advice to you would be to not take that test right before your exam. So yeah, those were the four main resources I used for practice test questions. My third tip would be to personalize your study plan and your time frame. So I guess the very first thing would be to figure out when you plan to take the exam and how many weeks you plan to study. I personally studied for 6 weeks, and I crafted my study plan based on the three main resources from tip number one. It is a little difficult to form your study plan because you have so much information, you don't really know how to condense it. But just to give an example of how I did my study plan, I started with like the very basics. So foundations in OT was like my very first topic on my study plan. So this section included things like the domain and process, the ethics of OT, the OT frameworks, and then also reviewing the OTPF. My next section was focused on adult occupational therapy. So this included things like orthopedic conditions, mental health, um, stroke, brain injuries, neuro conditions. For adult OT, I would probably focus like on upper extremity injuries, so like shoulder conditions, wrist injuries, finger injuries, hand injuries. I believe I also grouped ergonomics within my adult OT section, so that's just the way that I personalized it for myself. And then I really struggled with pediatrics during my time in OT school, so I really made that a big focus in my study plan. So for each section, I would assign a certain amount of time that I would study each section, and I would give myself deadlines. So for example, for me personally, since foundations in OT really was just like a lot of memorization for me, and I'm really good at memorizing things. So I didn't really focus too much on that section because it was a little bit easier for me. So I think I gave myself like a week and a half to study that, and that was my deadline to get everything in that section studied and reviewed. And then, of course, I spent a little bit longer on the adult OT section of my study plan because that is a huge chunk of what is on the NBCOT exam. And then, since I did struggle with pediatrics during OT school, so I made sure to make that a big focus in my study plan. So I probably spent like 3 weeks studying pediatrics alone. So for my pediatrics section, that included things like autism, ADHD, common childhood disorders, the developmental milestones. I think some other really important things to include in that section are things like reflexes and common injuries during birth. And then I do remember a lot of sensory processing questions on the NBCOT exam, so I would kind of review that whole section. My next section, I know I had a section for splinting for like elbow, wrist, and hand. And that was kind of just like a little mini section for me. I didn't focus too much on it because, again, that's something that comes with visuals, and like for some reason, visuals and then just like being able to remember things, it came naturally to me. So I didn't really focus on that. But if you feel like you struggle with a certain section, definitely lengthen the amount of time you spend on that. And my very last section, I believe, was reviewing evaluation and assessment tools. So this included things like reviewing standardized testing and criterion reference testing. I believe in this section, I also focused on like MMT, Rancho's Los Amigos scale, and then also goniometer measurements and knowing like the different range of motion degrees. So yeah, that's just kind of how I laid out my study plan. I will put a link in the description with a PDF so that you can see how the study plan was laid out, and then maybe you can download that and use that for yourself. So organizing your study plan is one of the very first things you need to do in preparation for the NBCOT exam. Again, don't stress out about the forming of your study plan because it's going to come naturally to you based on what you feel you know and what you don't know. Okay, so my fourth study tip would be to simulate the testing environment. So I personally like to study in louder environments. I feel like that's just a little bit more stimulating for my brain. But I knew when it came to doing practice questions or taking a practice exam, I really needed to be in a quiet environment. That's because when you take the NBCOT exam, it is so quiet. It's in a quiet testing room. And of course, there's other people there, but they try to keep it as quiet as possible. So I just really tried to simulate that type of environment. Another tip I would give would be to practice with those noise canceling headphones on because I remember when I went to go take my exam, I didn't think I was going to use those headphones, but there was someone right behind me just like tapping their pencil, and I could not focus because I was so nervous. And so I ended up asking for the headphones, and it just felt like really weird on me. And I was like, damn, I wish I had practiced with these on so that I can just feel comfortable. So if that is something that you're planning on using, I would definitely practice that, maybe having something over your ears to help simulate that environment the best you can. Another thing I did is because I planned to take my NBCOT exam really early in the morning, I decided to do my practice test around the same time that I planned to take my NBCOT exam. So usually my practice tests, I did them around like 7 or 8 a.m. So if you are someone who feels like you thrive a little bit better taking exams midday, then I would practice taking your practice exam during midday and then also try to schedule your exam at that midday hour. Okay, my very last tip would be to learn how to answer NBCOT practice questions. So in order to do this, you really have to get your reps in your practice questions. So what that means is just do a ton of practice questions. That is why I like the practice questions that came with the rationales, because they really provided a lot of clarity in why you were getting an answer wrong or why you were getting it right. That was another thing I forgot to mention. The NBCOT practice questions and the AOTA practice questions did not have good rationale. So I never knew what I was doing wrong when I got a question wrong on those. So that's another reason I was recommending the other ones, but that's something totally different. But yeah, I remember after each study session, I would do maybe like 10 to 15 practice questions after each study session. And if you're studying like 4 days a week, then you're doing like 40 practice test questions. I think that's a really great way for you to feel a little bit more comfortable answering those, because some of them can get a little tricky, but the more consistent you are with taking those, the more you're going to feel confident in answering them. Another thing that I see a lot of people do, and I remember seeing a lot of people do in my cohort, was over analyzing the questions. And I know that's really hard to like not do, but just look for what the question is asking you for. Be very to the point with the question. Don't think too deeply into it, because trust me, they are not making it that complicated. I'm hoping to post maybe like some practice test question videos a little later on, because I think it provides a lot of like clarity, and it helps students kind of see how someone else's mind works when answering those questions. So yeah, just get your reps in on questions and don't overanalyze, and make sure that you're finding resources that have really good rationales, because those really help. Okay, I thought that was my last tip, but it wasn't. I actually have one more tip, but it's not like that lengthy. Now my very last tip is do not overstudy. This was really important for me when I was studying for the NBCOT exam. I even had this rule for myself while I was in grad school. I remember a lot of people in my cohort would study while on the toilet, they'd study while they're in the shower, they would study while they're eating their lunch, and I was like, not about that. I think it's very important to separate like your personal life and then like your study life, because you don't want to be stressed all the time. It's very important to have those moments of downtime and those moments where you're not thinking about OT school stuff. So please, please, please do not study on the toilet. Even if it's just like listening to a podcast while you're in the shower, please don't do that. That you're just like stimulating your sympathetic nervous system, and you're increasing your heart rate. And so now every time you do those activities that are supposed to be relaxing and supposed to be personal, you're just increasing your heart rate and your blood pressure and making yourself super nervous. So yeah, take frequent study breaks. I remember I would take tons of breaks while studying. I hated being cooped up studying all day, and so I would probably study for like 45 minutes and then like take like a 15-minute break, go walk around. I remember when I would be in coffee shops, very first thing I would do would be to order my coffee, and then I wouldn't drink my coffee while I studied. I would sit and relax and enjoy my coffee. I would probably journal, because I like to journal, or I would probably just like watch like a YouTube video right before I started studying. And so yeah, just don't overstudy. Make sure that you have a good life balance. Make sure that you're eating enough, getting enough sleep, still going out to socialize, maybe going out with girlfriends to have a drink. I don't know. So yeah, those were just a few tips that I felt helped me when I was studying for the NBCOT exam. I hope those were helpful, and I'm hoping to post more videos on here sharing just kind of my insights and some tips that I felt like I really could find useful when I was a new grad. So yeah, keep watching. Bye.